Welcome back to the Fertile Dark. Today's episode is a special one because it's all about you, your questions, your curiosities, and the deep, thought-provoking topics that have been stirring in your minds. And I love these Q&A episodes because they give us a chance to explore the questions that are most alive in our community. Questions that are about navigating life's complexities, finding clarity, making sense of the world around us. And in this episode, we're diving into some big topics, such as how do we balance personal beliefs without adding to division? How can we build real confidence and self-esteem? What's the best way to relieve stress when nothing seems to quiet the mind? And how do we even know if we're on the right path in life? We'll also get into some reflections from others, whether objective truth exists, and some insights about my own journey balancing life, work, and fulfillment. I'm really excited to dig into these with you, and so let's get started. It's been about a year since we've done one of these, and so I just want to start out, I think first and foremost, by expressing some gratitude to everyone who has been on this journey with me from the beginning, as well as to those of you who have joined along the way. This project has really been a labor of love that has emerged in some surprising ways, and I'm really grateful to all of you that have felt inspired to join me on the journey as well. And as we go, there are a couple of things that are going to be coming out actually this week that I'm really excited about. So stay tuned because we're going to go into those. But first and foremost, let's jump into our first question. How does one balance their personal beliefs and emotions with society without discriminating and causing more commotion? What is the best way to do so? Love this question. Such a good one, especially as we're really focused on this idea of developing psycho-spiritually in the world around us. When we're in that developmental place, it's really interesting the way that we begin to see ourselves differently, and then by extension, we see the world differently. And sometimes it can be difficult to know how is it that we show up in the world without feeling discriminatory, without making things worse. And I think there's a lot of nuance to this question. I think first and foremost, it's important to realize that there are a lot of ways to address this. One way is to really address the motivation behind this desire to not cause more commotion. That is a really important place to start. For example, something that I know about myself is that I tend to be a little conflict avoidant. I really resonate with this experience of creating peace in the world around me, and sometimes conflict can become very uncomfortable for me. For example, like if two people are in the other room and they're having a really heated argument, I get really uncomfortable really fast. Like I have this impulse to step in and soothe everything out because it helps reduce my discomfort. I also can be a little codependent at times. I can be a little enmeshed at times, and I can prioritize other people's needs above my own in an unhealthy kind of way. And there's a lot of reasons for that. And it's something that I'm really developing some awareness and skills around in my own journey, but it's something I'm aware of. I also know that sometimes I can be a bit of a people pleaser. Sometimes I am willing to reduce conflict at the expense of my own authenticity. So I think that's important just contextually to be able to think about is what is it that's really motivating this desire to not cause commotion? Because I don't know that commotion is always a bad thing. It's important to realize that as we're developing, as we're growing, that's important. We don't exist in a vacuum. We exist within a shared space. And as we change and as we grow, the people around us are going to feel that. And there's some natural tension that's going to emerge. Some of that is going to be the tension that we bring into that space from being in it differently. Some of that is going to be from people that have been around us long enough that they're used to a different version of us. Now they're trying to figure out how do they navigate the nuance of how we have changed. And sometimes that can be really uncomfortable. And that's not a bad thing. It can stimulate a lot of really beautiful and productive interaction. I think back to when my partner was first in grad school. She would come home from class and she would bring these really big subjects up. And it caused a lot of commotion in our relationship. Not bad, but really uncomfortable. And there was a lot of really important things that came from that, a lot of really important growth. And at the time, I would say, I don't know that I was really particularly in a state of preparation for a lot of those conversations, at least consciously. But having my partner come home and bring those kinds of topics up for me, it stimulated a lot of growth that was necessary, both individually and relationally for the two of us. And that really set me on a path to get to the place where I'm at now. And I still wrestle with some of those things, and I wrestle with them in different ways than she did. And also because I've been wrestling with those things, and because there has been commotion that's been introduced inside of me and then also within my relationships, there's been a lot of really beautiful growth that has happened. I've met some really wonderful people that have really changed me for the better in ways that I wish I had words to adequately express my gratitude for. It also has caused some difficulty. There are relationships with other people that no longer persist in my life. There has been a certain degree of pruning that's happened where my growth led to a certain degree of incompatibility that emerged. And that's important to realize that that's not a bad thing. Not all relationships are meant to or necessary to persist throughout the duration of our life. There's times and seasons for relationships, and that's normal, that's okay. And we can express gratitude for the beauty of the relationships, for the time that we had them. We can express grief when those relationships run their course. What that does is it also creates space for new relationships that are more suited for who we are becoming in our own personal development journey. So that's another facet to this that I think is important. So it's not always bad to cause a commotion. At the end of the day, commotion is important. Commotion is causing growth within the system. The one caution I would give around this, yes, commotion is important. However, we can inappropriately introduce commotion as well. And I think that's where the other half of this comes in. It is the introducing or balancing personal beliefs and emotions with society without discriminating. And that's really important. Is when we introduce commotion, when we introduce tension from a place of discrimination, that is a very different experience. And that is one that should really be evaluated and considered. I really love the 8 C's of capital S self and the internal family systems model, because when we are in a place of capital S self, it's really difficult to be discriminatory, because when we're in self, we experience things like curiosity and compassion and calm. We have clarity. There's a lot of these really beautiful things that are happening that make it very difficult for discriminatory experience internally. At least for myself, when I consider times when I feel discriminatory, meaning that I feel very judgmental and there is a hierarchical relationship that is being created interpersonally, that is always coming from a place that is not self. There's something else happening internally that is motivated by a protective facet of my psyche rather than a connective facet. And so if I'm feeling that kind of judgmental, discriminatory experience, then I can check myself. If I'm feeling a need for advocacy, that's not bad. That's actually really important. It's directly connected to a lot of different archetypal facets, particularly this warrior archetype. The warrior is the one that is an advocate, and they particularly advocate and protect those parts of ourselves that are orphaned or wandering, or those parts of others that are in that space. The warrior archetype exists in this protective advocacy place. So that's really important. But when we step into a place of judgment and discrimination, we're no longer in the fullness of the warrior. We've now moved into the shadow of the warrior. You have the sadist and the masochist, the ones that create these power-based relationships that are really harmful. So what I would say here is, if you're working to balance personal beliefs and emotions with society without discriminating and causing more commotion, step one is you got to check yourself. Check yourself for the discrimination piece, which is, am I in capital S self? Do I feel calm, curious, compassionate, have some clarity here? And also check yourself for any resistance around the need to not cause commotion. If you have a feeling that commotion needs to be caused, there's potentially a really good justification for that. Just check yourself on that and say, why do I feel resistance to that? Allow yourself to sit with it. If you want a good explanation of how to do that from a mindfulness place, go to our last episode that we recorded with Charmaine Fuller. She did a really great explanation of how to practice mindfulness. That will help with that a lot. And then when you really are able to work with all of those different pieces, what I find is that for me personally, I am now able to bring myself into the world in a way that doesn't feel so discriminatory, that doesn't feel so judgmental, that maybe causes some commotion, but causes the right kind of commotion. I often also find like a certain skill set can be helpful here in the way that I interact with other people. And I really like the idea of reflective listening. I think that can be really helpful. So whenever I am in a good place, when I'm grounded in that capital S self place, I can hold a lot of space for complexity in other people's experience. And it also allows me to see and hear them in a way where I can then reflect back to them what I'm hearing, which allows them to correct me if I'm misunderstanding. But it also allows them to see themselves differently. And that's a really helpful thing to do. It really fosters a connective experience where we're not just talking at people, but we're really communicating in a connective way. Those are some things. I know that's a little bit of a long answer, but I think that can be some helpful tools, hopefully, to be able to work with this. So if you're the one wrestling with this, I would love to hear more about your experience. Also, feel free with any of these questions, just reach out to me, let me know about it. I want to hear how it goes. I want to hear your kind of follow-on questions as well. Okay, next question. How are you, Dan, seeing your own advancements with how you're balancing life, teaching students who are looking up to you in a leadership position, while also keeping your life fun and fulfilling outside of work? Love this question. And this was from one of the students I've been teaching actually for several years, who really great individual, deep thinker, just really brings a great perspective to the world. So for me, part of the reason I'm so grateful for this question is because this is something that I really struggle with. I have noticed for myself that I have a very hustle-based mentality. So because of a lot of my experiences from the past, I really come at life from this place of hustle and scarcity. And so it's actually really difficult for me to balance my time and balance my energy, particularly around having fun. I have to schedule myself fun. And even then, when I schedule it, I often do it in a way where I'm often in some fun adjacent capacity. So it's kind of tough for me, but it is something that I've been working on. And something that I really try and do is consistently be checking in with myself. It's really helpful because as I'm I shouldn't say constantly, but as I'm consistently making time for that check-in, and I mean, I'm trying to do this on a daily basis where I have a journal out and I am having like a prompt to dig deep within myself, even just for a little bit every single day. And then I have a little accountability system that I've set up so I can see how on track I am. So for example, the last few days I haven't been very good at it. which isn't surprising because the last few days have been incredibly stressful for me. And as soon as I get into that ultra high stress place, a lot of these self-care things fall away. But I try and do this regular daily practice that is rooted in deepening my capacity for insight, which often I find I get to a place of essentially calling myself out where I'm lacking. I also have people in my life that are really great mirrors for me. They help me to see myself a little more clearly, and they are really good at supporting that balance. So, for example, my partner, she and I we actually have an agreement where we have reality check conversations. Like we just ask each other, hey, can I have a reality check here? That's something that's really helpful. There's also a rule that we've developed in our relationship where if it isn't a hell yes, it's a hell no, which is something that's really helpful for me in being able to manage my own energy expenditure. So last year, I got to a place where I had been hustling for so long and I'd been hustling so much and pushing myself so hard and not listening to my body and not listening to the people around me, and just like, I'm not sleeping well, I'm not sleeping enough, burning the candle at both ends. I'm engaged in a lot of things that aren't even like authentic for me. Like I'm not necessarily interested in them from a real authentic place. And I got so sick. I was laid out. I genuinely thought I was going to die from the experience. And it made me take a step back and start reevaluating. And the last, I don't know, year at this point has been a real pruning experience. And some of that means that I have had to say no to a lot of stuff. So she and I, like my partner and I, we have this kind of set of rules and this quality of relationship where she's able to help me see things that I can't see myself, even through my own regular practice. The other thing is I've really tried to develop my capacity to put myself in timeout, which I don't know that on the surface, that's something that people would think about. This has been especially important over the last, 7, 8 years as I've worked in the teaching environment, but even in other situations, I've had to really develop this capacity to put myself in timeout. When I feel my nervous system becoming dysregulated, I have learned to walk away for the most part. I'm not perfect at it. There are definitely days when I have lost my cool, when I've blown up and I've said some things to people that maybe were accurate. Maybe it was accurate to the situation, but it was not done in the right way. So I've had to learn to put myself in timeout to avoid that so that my communication can be connective. I've also had to develop a lot of humility, and I've had to learn to ask for help. So how does that look for me? So that there's a couple ways that that's looked. One is that over the last year and a half, I've been pretty regular at doing personal therapy twice a month. That's about the sweet spot for me. There are some times I could use it every week, and there's sometimes I've done back-to-back weeks. There's sometimes there's been, a month in between. A regular practice of meeting with a therapist has been huge for me in doing exactly this thing, because I often can't see how to have a better balance. Like I just don't have the insight sometimes. And so I can bring that in, and then my therapist can hold the space in a way that helps me to be able to find that wise balance. So that's another thing that's been really helpful. And so what I find is that I'm having lots of these opportunities to just check in. I'm creating a lot more white space in my calendar, like a lot more blank space in the calendar. And I'm being a lot more intentional about the kinds of things that I'm scheduling myself for. And that has allowed me to manage my energy expenditure so that I actually have the capacity to have more fun. I also have been trying to have a lot more insight around the kind of work specifically that I'm saying yes to. One of the reasons that I left teaching was to start clinical field work. But another reason I left teaching was that I found that there was so much stress that I was holding on to on a regular basis that I just wasn't able to really have fun anymore. I was so serious and so stressed all the time. I couldn't let it go. And there are a lot of reasons for that. But as a result, of leaving that, I've been able to relax a lot more and feel like I'm able to take much more aligned action. So I don't know if that really answers the question, but there's a lot of self-care that's been happening. There's a lot of insight development that's been happening. There's a lot more white space or blank space in my calendar I've been creating. And I have been filling my life with relationships that are supportive for those kinds of things. And then creating social contracts that help support that healthy balance. So that's something that's been really helpful for me, that kind of set of things, which for me, like as I vocalize it, as I verbalize that, wow, like there's a lot that I've had to do there to be able to find that balance. But for me, the last 23 years have just been so focused on the hustle from a place of scarcity that it's really taken that much work to be able to do that. Also, one other thing that I've done in terms of balancing, because I love this part right here, like there are this person, brought up balancing teaching students looking up to me in a leadership position while also being fulfilling outside of work. I've really worked to make sure that in my interaction with other people, I just try and be genuine and authentic and have meaningful interaction. I'm not a good small talk person. I can do it. I don't necessarily prefer it. It's not my preference. I do really like to have meaningful, insight building kind of conversation. I like to feel really connected to people. And so I just decided that I would prioritize that in my interaction, which it in some ways isn't normal. And what that has meant is that the conversations and the relationships I've had where that's been allowed, that's been okay, that there has been a lot more meaning that's been made and found and a lot more enjoyment and fulfillment in my daily interactions. And then I also find that people who we don't have enough rapport for that we're able to maintain the appropriate level of distance to be able to keep things at like a safe level. And I don't want this to sound like I'm prying or I'm trying to dig into people's world at a level that isn't appropriate or that makes people uncomfortable, but rather I'm just trying to have meaningful connection with people on a regular basis. And that's what I'm prioritizing. And then that's helped me find a better balance in the way that I connect to people. I've also learned to be okay talking about my struggles. That's been really hard. And I don't know how that's been received. At least for some people, they've said that's been really helpful to let them know that I'm a human being, that I have struggles, that I'm working through life too. And it gives them an opportunity to feel validated, to feel like they're not alone. And also to see that, yes, it is possible to work through these hard things that they're experiencing. So that's another piece that I've done too, is trying to learn to incorporate a little bit more vulnerability, which didn't feel safe for a really long part of my life. Next question. Okay. So how can I figure out and approach plans for the future, specifically with education and other pursuits? Love this question. It's something that has been on my mind quite a bit recently. It ties in really closely with two other questions that are in this list that I'm going to move up a little bit here and share, and then maybe dig into all of them a little bit. So we have also, how do we know if we're on the right path? How do we know if we're meant to do something / if what we're doing is good for us? And what is your biggest motivator to get out of bed in the morning? So all three of these questions feel very connected to me in my mind, just from different places along the path. But these first two, how do I figure out and approach plans for the future, specifically around education and other pursuits? And then how do we know if we're on the right path? How do we know if we're meant to do something / if what we're doing is good for us? Those two feel very much aligned in the question. And there is a ton of research, writing, information around these questions. There is this idea that has come from mental health professionals, from psychologists specifically, from other people who work in mental health adjacent capacities, that comes from so many different angles. But there is this idea of soul that really addresses this question. The idea is that each person is born with an ultimate place in the world that only they occupy. And then there's a lot of work around that idea of being connected to that from a mythological place, from a poetic place, from a psychological place. The essence of depth psychology is about connecting to soul and then embodying it in the world. Right? This process of individuation. One book that I'm excited about because we're going to be doing a transformational book group for the Fertile Dark, and it's going to be the first book we're going to focus on. It's called Nature and the Human Soul. Is actually a revised perspective of human development that is focused around developing soul-centric community, specifically in helping answer the questions of how do we know we're meant to do something, / if what we're doing is good for us? How do we know if we're on the right path? How can I figure out and approach plans for the future? What is your biggest motivation to get out of bed in the morning? The entire book is focused on how do we do that individually, and also how do we create community that supports that expression and provides the structure necessary for all members of the community to do so. So that's something that's really important to understand, is that these questions are honestly very well researched. And also, I mean, this we're talking about an existential quest for meaning. This is a universal question that people ask. So I was doing a little bit of reading up before this so that I could share a few thoughts that will hopefully help a little bit here. So short answer to one question: how do we know if we're meant to do something? The answer is yes, you are meant to do something. The question here is, how do we know? I think this is a challenging question because the what is often our primary focus. I mean, we live in a post-industrial society that is still deeply rooted in the Industrial Revolution. Our traditional educational system is rooted in the industrial revolution mindset. If you just look at the school system itself, it is designed to churn out product. That's what happens, right? We're being socialized, we're being educated from a place of what job are you going to fill in the system when you finish school. Now, there have been plenty of changes in there that are, I think, trying to push for something more fulfilling. We're not there yet. And it's really not hard to see that if you just start listening to the language you use. For example, what are you going to be when you grow up? Like, people aren't what's. Like, what job are you going to do? That is very different than what are you going to be. We're conflating career with identity. So that's one challenge that we have. And I think that a lot of this comes down to that. So there are a variety of things we can look at that can help us to identify this. Are we on the right path? How do we plan for education and other life experience around the future? How do we know if we're on the right path? How can we increase our motivation on a daily basis? So Thomas More actually wrote this really cool book called A Life at Work, and it really deals with the essence of this from the perspective of a depth psychologist. There are really so many different ways you could go. Just for the sake of time, I only picked a couple. So here's one thing he says. A calling is a sensation or intuition that life wants something from you. It can give meaning to the smallest acts and helps create a strong identity. If you have a reason for being, you don't feel entirely aimless. You know who you are and what to do. In a culture where existential anxiety, the worry that nothing is of value and nothing makes sense, is still the order of the day, these are valuable realizations. And this really feels like it addresses the underlying nature of these questions, right? Who we are, what we want to do in a culture where existential anxiety is the order of the day. So there are a variety of ways that we can be connected to this experience. There's an idea that I want to say is a Greek philosophical idea that is also brought into depth psychology that I really like. It's called the Daimon. It's essentially this spirit that lives within us that needs expression in the world. It's really connected to this idea of purpose in the world. And so I love the way that Thomas More talks about it in this book. He says, in ancient practice, when people actually spoke of their daimon, they didn't always name it. Sometimes they thought of the classical deities as daimons, the daimonic Aphrodite, goddess of beauty and sexuality, or the daimon Demeter, Mother Earth. Usually they imagined the daimon as pointing in a certain direction while remaining nameless. To recognize your daimon, you have to ask yourself what mysterious power keeps you fascinated in a particular direction. You can see the daimon clearly in your friends. It's more difficult, perhaps, to pinpoint the daimonic influence in yourself. You can look back on your life, even if you are young, and notice the focus of your fascinations, interests, and desires. You may have obscured your daimon by trying too hard to be reasonable and conventional, so you may have to look beneath the surface. What compels you? Where do you typically lean? You can always take the route of Socrates and notice the nature of your inhibitions. Do you hear a quote-unquote voice telling you not to do things, not to take this job, not to move to this city, not to trust this company? If you are going to live daimonically, you take these inhibitions seriously. You decline a job simply because you hear a faint warning within. You trust your deepest intuitions. You remain alert for inner guidance. So I love this idea of the daimon. It's really great. There is that intuitive trust that exists within the body and that connection to our interests, the things that really light us up inside. And it really can be very difficult, especially like in that teenage kind of zone. But even as an adult, I mean, we've really been conditioned so much socially to suppress and repress those unique aspects of ourselves in pursuit of a career that fits within a mold. And we're really trained to not stand out, right? Or to stand out in certain ways that are deemed socially appropriate, rather than to find that thing that lights us up in a unique way and the way that wants to be expressed in the world. So that's something that you can do is we can sit down and we can work with that. And that can be really, really helpful. In the book Wild Mind, this is by Bill Plotkin, who specializes in these questions from his place as an eco-depth psychologist and as a wilderness guide. In Wild Mind, he's looking at the individual psyche from a place of wholeness, and this question, this kind of existential question around like meaning and purpose and place in the world factors in here. So he's going to approach it from a little bit different perspective, but I think it can be really helpful to really just relax into this a little bit as we explore this idea. He says, in Western egocentric cultures, the imagination has been contrasted with and pitted against truth and reality. It was just my imagination. Leave the dull, everyday world behind and escape into the land of imagination. But in fact, the deep imagination is an indispensable faculty for discovering the truth about everyday life, no less essential than observing, thinking, and feeling. The deep imagination not only shows us what might be, but also illuminates what already is. It reveals things we may never have detected with our senses or emotions or by deduction. The deep imagination is also our primary resource for recognizing the emerging future, for quote-unquote seeing the visionary possibilities of what we can create right now, individually and collectively, and consequently for creating a better world. It is our essential resource for all genuine human creativity. Sadly, through unimaginative education, entertainment, and religion, egocentric culture has suppressed and deflected the deep imagination And yet, the muse or dreamer waits within everyone to be reclaimed as an indispensable resource for liberating ourselves from the flatlands and wastelands of the mainstream and for designing and building new life-enhancing societies. So here's the short version of that. When you sit down quietly, when no one else is around, and you allow yourself to imagine into the future, to visualize the future, what are the things that light you up? When you look at the place that you're in presently, what are the facets of it that stimulate every facet of your creative expression? What are the things that make you want to work endlessly in a way that is connected to people around you and the world itself? Maybe not in like I'm out with people all the time, but just in a way that is connected to people. When you sit in that place and like the thing that is stimulating your excitement, stimulating your vision for the future, the thing that you just feel compelled into action around, that is a great indicator of what is speaking to you from the inside. And there are a lot of ways that you can know that you're on the right path. For example, next week, I'm doing an episode with Amanda O'Donovan. She specializes in human design. She actually talks about this specific thing of like, how do different types of people know when they're off track versus on track? One of the ways that I personally know that I'm off track is if I feel frustrated. Frustration, for me, that's a great indicator that I'm not on the path of self, like capital S self or soul or however you want to discuss it. But she's going to do that. So make sure you listen next week. It's going to be super helpful. But we can also look at it and say, like, how do I know if I'm on the right path? Well, how much creativity are you experiencing? How much inspiration do you feel? Are you just going through the motions? Do you feel alive? Do you feel filled with the potential of abundance? Do you feel inspired? If not, take a step back and say, well, what do you feel those things around? And often what you find is that there begins to be a certain degree of emergence that happens. It's really normal to feel like I went to school for a thing, or I want to study this thing, or people told me I should study this thing, or people told me that I should do this thing, and then to pursue it. And there's nothing wrong with that. You can actually bring this inner purpose into the world in a lot of different ways, because what you're doing becomes a delivery system. And that's a conversation, I think, for a different day. But really what you want to be doing is looking inside and saying, what is it that's really lighting me up? Something that might help. There's actually an entire book that I'd recommend you read. I think this is one of my most recommended books to people. It's Soulcraft by Bill Plotkin. Go read it, listen to it. There's some really beautiful practices in there that are really great. One of which that has been really helpful for me is what's called a nature wander. And essentially what you do is you ritually go and you spend a decent amount of time on the land by yourself, and you have a communal experience. So one example of that is that you might go for a nature wander with the intention of coming back with a physical object that helps to represent a unique, like your unique place in the world or something connected to it. So I did that one time. It was a really beautiful experience, honestly. I grabbed my journal, grabbed my pen. I had about 45 minutes to an hour, drove to this trailhead on my way to pick up my kids from school. I went to the beginning of the trailhead, and there's this row of rocks that demarks the border of the trail. I stood to the rocks and I made clear my intention. Like, I am going to wander on the land to receive an understanding or an image of a physical object that represents the unique place that I can occupy within the world, or something connected to it. And then I just set off on this trail and I just went kind of wherever. I just wandered around and really tried to be in this space of just awareness of what was happening inside, and eventually got to a place where I felt like I needed to sit down and start writing. And so I found some rocks, I sat down, I opened up my journal, And I don't think I voiced this aloud, but I just closed my eyes and I asked the question, like, what is the physical symbol that is representing this place for me that I need to occupy within a community? And I finished the question. I had an image come into mind. I had an image of a drum. It was a very specific drum that came into mind. And then I pulled out my pen, I pulled out my journal, I just started writing. And it wasn't that I wrote a drum, like there was this whole page of notes that I wrote down in my journal that I then got to interact with a little bit. Like, well, what does that mean? And what is this symbol representing here? And that was a very helpful experience for me in understanding a little bit more kind of this knowing of being on the right path, because then it could inform me a little bit more about how to tailor my approach to being in the world. Formed some educational choices I made in terms of classes that I took, as well as some professional development opportunities that I pursued. It's opened some doors for me in terms of community connections. There are a variety of different ways that things have changed. And I also have this symbol now in my mind's eye that I can check in with. So there's a lot of ways you can work with that. So we've got some journaling, we've got some wandering that will be really helpful. And also there's a lot of what are called soulcraft practices that can help. Something else I'd encourage you to do, if these are some questions you have, is to ask the question, but rather than saying things like, how do I know, or how can I figure out, ask the question a little bit different way, and take those questions. And then before you go to bed, write them in your journal and then record your dreams, and do this for a period of time and see what emerges for you. And then begin to work with those dreams. We did a whole episode on dream work. Also, if you're like trying to figure that out, feel free to reach out to me and we can talk about some strategies on working with those dreams. So hopefully that's helpful there on those questions. What I do find though is, for me, when I am living a life that is aligned with what feels for me is very purposeful and attuned to my, like as Thomas More, my daimonic energy, like my soul's purpose in the world. When I feel aligned with that, I have no problem getting out of bed in the morning. When I am when I'm in a place where I am feeling abundance and I'm feeling aliveness, I can't wait to get out of bed. I'm so excited for the day. Even when there's stressors, I'm just excited. Now, I'm not saying that this is every day. I struggle with depression, and there are also some days when I just want to lay in bed and I want to pull the blanket over my head and I just want to sleep all day. There are days I don't want to talk to anybody. There are days that the worst thing that someone could do is ask me how I'm doing. That's a real thing for me too. And so I don't want it to sound like it's perfect. And so there's a lot of self-care that goes into managing the depression. I also find, and also when I am living from a place of aligned action, my excitement and motivation to get out of bed in the morning and to do self-care and to get after it and to just like go out into the world with a smile on my face is so much higher. It really makes so much difference. Like I feel like I can just throw myself into my day and come out in that place of like tired and fulfilled. Like I feel so satisfied. Now I can go to sleep. The times that I have not felt that way, I take that as an indicator that maybe something needs to change. Like I need to do some adjusting. And that's a really important thing to keep in mind. So really long answer to some really deep questions. And we're actually going to be doing an episode on soul gifts coming up. I'm really excited about that. We're going to be talking about some of these and having a little bit more of a special deep dive into that exploration. I'm also working on a recording for an episode about one of the things that keeps us from connecting to this, which is called spiritual bypass. So stay tuned for that. Also, an episode coming up where we're going to talk about it from a mythic perspective of like, how do you recognize and respond when like mythic archetypal figures are really calling to you, and like, how do you recognize the call and embrace it? Kind of like a heroine's journey kind of approach, but with specific mythic figures. So that will also be real helpful for these. Okay. How do I relieve stress or anxiety? It seems that everything I try can never quiet my mind. Beautiful question. So difficult, so real. Unfortunately, anxiety is one of the greatest problems that is facing the world today. If you want a really great resource, I would recommend Martha Beck's new book, Beyond Anxiety. Go look it up. It's an awesome read, recommended to me by an amazing friend and has not disappointed. And she is really brilliant at exploring this topic of anxiety. I also want to see if we can do a little bit right here, right now to work with it. When we look at anxiety, there's a couple of things that can be helpful. There are a lot of different ways that we experience anxiety in the world and in our lives. We can start to ask ourselves, is this trait anxiety or state anxiety? Meaning, am I feeling anxious in this moment, but that's an unusual experience? Or is this something that I deal with as a constant piece of my lived experience? And that changes a little bit about how you might deal with it. There are a lot of different factors that influence the emergence and expression of anxiety in our lived experience, and is well beyond the scope of anything we could do here together right now. There are some tools and resources we can work with that I think can be helpful. My very first thing is, if anxiety is something that you really struggle with, like if you're at this place where you say, it seems that everything that I try can never quiet my mind, like, I just would strongly recommend find a good therapist, right? Like, listening to this is, I'm really grateful that you're doing that. This is not therapy. You should find a really good therapist. Don't just find someone who says, I specialize in anxiety. Find someone who specializes in anxiety and then call them, talk to them, interview them, and make sure they are a good fit, and then work with them on it. That would be my number one recommendation. If you have that level of anxiety, get some professional help. There's a stigma around this process of working with a therapist. Believe me, I understand. I was in the military for a long time. There's a huge stigma around therapy. They would tell you, you probably need to do it, but then if you did it, you were penalized for it. It was just this catch-22. I also grew up in like the 80s, 90s, 2000s, when if you went to a therapist, you were crazy. We see a lot of pop psychology stuff on social media. There's a lot of portrayals in the media about what therapy is like. Take all of that stuff and set it aside. Anxiety can be crippling. It is nothing to laugh about. Like, it's real. I mean, you can laugh about it if you're in a good place, but it's not something that we can just laugh off, is what I mean. Go and get some help, because it will make such a difference in your life. Take it from someone who struggles with some anxiety. It really makes a huge difference. Now, there are a lot of different approaches that people can use. There are a lot of tools that you can use outside of the therapy room that can be helpful. I have a couple that I can share with you. But as long as it's clear that whatever I share is no substitute for working in legitimate therapeutic relationship with a licensed therapist. So here are some things we can look at when it comes to anxiety. And there are a variety of approaches. I really have resonated with the internal family systems approach, which is that we have parts of ourselves that are anxious. So when I feel anxious, I feel anxiety, that is a part of me that is feeling anxious, and I can then work with that part. And the book No Bad Parts is a great one to look at that gives a lot of different exercises that we can do to come into the right relationship with those parts of ourselves, as well as to develop a greater capacity for what is called self-energy, meaning that I'm calm, I'm curious, I have clarity here, right? Think about it like the movie Inside Out. Like, you're inside this girl's mind and there's all of these different emotions that are inside, and there's a control panel. And when different emotions are like at the control panel, it changes the experience of the girl. Sometimes we have these experiences where we become blended with a part, where like that part of us is in the driver's seat and we don't have any separation from it. Like what we really want to be able to do is come into a place of awareness of and relationship to, but not blended with. Anger is a really easy one to do this with. Like I can feel anger, I can feel frustration, those kinds of things. And also, I cannot yell at people and let anger be the one speaking. Anxiety can be worked with in a similar way. And so the process that you work through is when you feel the anxiety in your body, you focus on that anxiety and you find it in your body. And then you just notice, how do you feel towards it? And then you got to pay really close attention to what feelings come up. If I feel really curious, if I feel a lot of compassion for it, for that anxious part, like if I'm feeling calm and just aware of and noticing, I can then begin to have a relationship with that anxious part. If I have other things coming up, that means I've got a little bit more work to do. So for example, I have a real critical part that comes up often when I'm working with anxiety. That when I notice I'm feeling anxiety, I focus on it and I find it in my body. Like I feel this tightness in my chest. Like it's almost like harder to breathe sometimes. And then I feel towards that part and I'm like, man, why do I feel this way? I shouldn't feel anxious. That's so dumb. It doesn't even make any sense. I have this real critical part that shows up, and that's a really great indicator I'm not in self and that I actually have another part that's there that maybe needs to give me some space. Now, this process can be beautiful in a lot of ways, but especially because from this framework, what's happening is that anxiety is there in a protective function. There's a part of us that's been wounded, that has been essentially like exiled, and this protective part is there to protect that exile wounded one. And it's doing a job it doesn't want to do. And we can actually help that part not have to do that job anymore. We can remove the burden of that job so that that part of ourselves can focus on being in a place that is more focused in like a wholeness perspective and self-supporting perspective. However, it can be like to do that on your own is really difficult. And that's why I say like you really want to have someone who you can work with that knows what they're doing, that can hold that space really well. There's also like the DBT lens, which is a skill-based framework that when you are experiencing some anxiety, you can focus on mindfulness, that just noticing, being with and just noticing it, not doing anything with it, just noticing it. And then you're going to practice validating, like some radical acceptance. I feel anxious right now, and that's a valid way to feel. I'm not going to be critical of it. I'm just going to acknowledge it and validate that I feel anxious. For me, if I go to the mall, I'm going to feel anxious. It's going to happen. And it makes total sense to me that I would feel anxious in the mall. And so when I go to the mall, I start to feel anxious. I allow myself to just have some awareness. I feel anxious. I notice how I feel in my body. I don't critique it. I just say, it makes so much sense that I feel anxious right now. I have some radical acceptance, right? Now, DBT will also give you some other tools like distraction and self-soothing. I think we're all pretty good at these two things, which is, okay, I've used some mindfulness. I've like developed some awareness around this anxiety. I validated it. And then now I'm going to soothe that anxiety. So for me, sometimes when I'm feeling really anxious, I'll go for a run, I'll go work out, or I might listen to some binaural beats. Or sometimes I feel anxious because my workload is so high and I've just been avoiding it and it's stacked up against me. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I feel so much stress and so much anxiety because my to-do list is so long and I just have to do something. And so what I do is I sit down and do some planning and I just organize my thoughts. I put on some binaural beats, and in that process, I kind of soothe that anxiety enough. And then I just block out time and I say, I'm going to work for the next 60 minutes and I'm just going to start at the top and I'm going to go to the bottom. And I'm going to get as far as I can in the next 60 minutes. And I like let everybody around me know, hey, I'm put my headphones on. I need you to leave me alone. I'm just going to be doing this work. And there have been times when the best thing I could do was go somewhere else and not do that work at home. And so you just kind of you work with that and you figure out what's going to help you the most. So that's more of like a DBT lens from my understanding, is that mindfulness, validation, distraction, self-soothing. The distraction piece is sometimes I feel really stressed out about work or about school. I'm going to go watch a movie. The other day, I was so anxious about this situation that I'm wrestling with. It's causing me so much stress. Like, I just have been noticing how tense I am in my shoulders and my neck. I found that my mind was spinning a little bit. And I was like, you know what? Like, I notice it. It's totally a valid way to feel. I'm going to go watch Gladiator 2. And I distracted myself from it. And then that self-soothing experience, the distraction, and then I felt a lot better. And then I could go and get stuff done that needed to get done and not feel crippled by my anxiety. One other approach is, it's also skill-based, and there are two tools here. There's deep breathing and visualization. Deep breathing, I use, some people call it box breathing. I've always called it combat breathing just because that's how I was introduced to it. You're basically breathing to counts of 4. So you breathe in for 4, hold for 4, breathe out for 4, hold for 4, and repeat 4 times. So 4 seconds on each side of the box, and then you do it 4 times. And you're really breathing as deep as you can. Like, sometimes when we're really stressed and anxious, we breathe into our chest. Like, you want to breathe into your abdomen, like deep breathing. There are lots of other ways of breathing. Sometimes you can do breathing exercises where you breathe into the point of stress. Like, you find it in your body. You breathe into the stress and then you breathe the stress out. Like, there's a lot of different ways that you can integrate deep breathing. Any of them can be helpful. You just have to find one that works for you. The other one's visualization. And there are a lot of different ways to visualize. My first experience with visualizing was called visualizing a peaceful scene. This takes a little bit more time. You basically do some meditation with it. You spend some time relaxing. You're counting your breath until my body begins to relax. And then I begin to visualize a peaceful scene. And I'm utilizing my senses in the visualization process. What am I seeing here? Like, what is the environment like? What time of day is it? Are there other people there? What's the weather like? I'm using like my sense of hearing, like what sounds do I hear? I'm using smell as well. Like, what does it smell like? Like, what's the feeling on my skin? Like, my sense of touch, what's my body position? And I'm framing all of this from the place of, I am in complete control of this space, of this scene. No one can be here and nothing can be here that I do not want here. I am in complete control, and it is a place that I feel completely safe. First time I did this, I was at the beach. There's this one section of beach in Huntington Beach in California that I spent hours at this one summer. And every time I would visualize a peaceful scene, I would be in that section of beach at sunset. It was so relaxing. As I've gotten older and as I've done this more, I often find myself most often in the forest. Sometimes it's raining, but most often it's not raining. It's a clear sky, and I'm often by myself. Sometimes there's like a campfire, just kind of whatever is this peaceful scene you're at. And then something else you can do that I've done with this particular activity, this particular visualization exercise, is you create some kind of talisman or totem within the visualization, like a physical object that you could reference in your mind's eye that connects you to the peaceful scene you've just created. And so, like, in a moment of distress, you can picture this talisman in your mind, and that more easily connects you back to this peaceful scene, and you can get there faster. And there are lots of other visualizations you can do. You can do like body relaxation visualizations, so many of them, but it's a skill you can use. So hopefully that helps a little bit with anxiety in terms of understanding and also connecting to anxiety. So there are a lot of different reasons. And because of all of the nuance and the intensity, that's why I recommend work with a professional. Yeah, I definitely recommend that. Okay, I'd love to hear your take on reflections we receive from others. When and how to take responsibility for what we receive. Love this question. So good. And also really valid to ask, when do we take responsibility for what we receive? I know a lot of people, myself included, that have been in relationships with individuals who demonstrate some personality qualities that can be really devastating and harmful and difficult in being able to discern what am I receiving in terms of accuracy. And I'm reluctant to dig into that too much, but there is one model that I really like when I think about what people are sharing with me as it relates to the reflections we receive from others, and like, what about our personal responsibility around that? So the theoretical model I really like is called the Johari window model. It's based on a quadrant kind of depiction here. In one quadrant, you have things that I know about myself and that other people know about me. Like, we all know that I am like this, or this is how I'm going to react around this, or this is things that everybody knows about me. There are things that I know about myself that other people don't know. There's like this kind of secret world that I hold that I maybe don't share with everybody. So, for example, like, not everybody knows that I really struggle with depression and anxiety. Those are things I really wrestle with. I also have a brave face that I put on in the world, and I try not to make a big deal of it. And not everybody knows that about me. There are also things that I feel inside that I don't always share with people. And those are personal choice, and it really comes down to the masks we wear. Another quadrant here are things that we are unaware of about ourselves, but that other people can see. And I think this is really the quadrant we're talking about in this question. These are our blind spots, the things that we just cannot see without somebody else reflecting them back to it. I've had some experiences where this has been done very poorly, where the conversation that I thought we were having was not actually the conversation we're having. It was done in a way that was very hurtful. So there are a couple things I'd recommend. When we are in this blind spot area, it's important to realize that sometimes the reflections we receive from other people are going to be really difficult for us to hear. It's in our blind spot for a reason. It's something we probably have been told. There's something about us that's like not appropriate. Like, hey, you shouldn't be like that. Or it's something that I don't like about myself. I wish I wasn't like that. So when we have that reflected back to us, sometimes that can be really difficult. So there's a couple things that I like to do to help me in this kind of receiving a reflection. I like to look at my internal landscape. I like to look at the relational dynamic. And then another thing I like to do is I like to look for patterns and themes of reflections. So sometimes what I find is that someone will tell me something and it's a one-off. They're having a bad day. It's actually their projection. Like, something about it, it just isn't, like, it's about them. It's not about me. And I find that if it's like a one-off, that oftentimes is a great helper for me to say, like, ooh, have I ever heard that before? Wow, that's really weird. A lot of times people tell me the opposite of that. So that's one thing that can be helpful is to look in that kind of relational space and evaluate for some, is there multiple data points here? And within that space, what I can do is I can also offer reflections back to the person to check for understanding. That can be really helpful because it helps provide some clarity for what's being shared with me. So then that way I really hear it. This is something that my partner is really, really good at. I will offer up something that I'm struggling with. She just reflects back and asks me questions until she feels like she's got a good read on it. But in the reflecting, there's a clarifying process that happens. And then I can look at that and say, have I ever heard this from anybody else? If it's a one-off, honestly, it's okay to just hold it and to say, like, I've never heard that before. I'm going to put that away and just let that sit. That's totally fine. I'm going to do anything with it other than look for some clarity, like look for some clarification there, reflect back, do your best. If it's possible to have to be a connective experience, it isn't always. Sometimes the best thing to do is If it's in a situation where connection's not possible, just walk away. That's totally fine as well. And come back to it later if it needs to be come back to. Within a relational context, though, like these reflections can be really, really helpful. Like reflections and clarification questions, I can really start to pay attention to my somatic experience, like what is happening in my body when this is happening. And that can be really helpful. Sometimes what happens is someone will share a reflection and it is hard to hear. I've had a couple of these recently where it was just like, it almost felt a little like abrupt. And my instant reaction was, that's not what it is. No, it's not. And that's a really good indication that like something's off in my system and that I need to take a step back. So anytime that someone is offering me some kind of reflection, I need to check in with myself and see if I can't get to a place of curiosity. Like that's really where I want to get to. Am I in a place of curiosity? And also then when I'm in that place of curiosity, then I can go through this process of reflection, clarification with the other person. I can ask them for those data points and say, okay, I hear you. Like, do you have some examples of when you've seen that? And sometimes that's really hard for people to answer. But I can be in that place of curiosity with that other person. And then what I can do is after that's all said and done, I can express some gratitude for what they've given me. I can hold it. And then I don't have to do anything with it necessarily right away, unless it is something that needs immediate attention. Like maybe I said or did something in the moment that was thoughtless or offensive or hurtful, and I just wasn't being thoughtful or attuned or present enough. In that moment, I can just make a quick correction, right? And I can work on repair. That's important. A lot of times these reflections we're being given by people are not in the moment things. It's like, this is a bigger thing. This is about some integration that needs to happen. So I'm going to take that back and then I'm going to get really curious about that. And I'm going to start to work with it a little bit. I'll share an example that might hopefully be helpful. At a military exercise, we were ahead of schedule and there was a determination made that the evening before last, people could consume alcohol as long as they behaved appropriately. I had a team member at the time who was really activated by that for some really valid reasons and was becoming very dysregulated around it. As the team leader, my job then, as we discussed it, was to just go to my supervisor and to express a concern and say, hey, I get it. Everybody wants to blow some steam. Everybody wants to relax. We also have this situation that's developing. Now, for my part, that's where I was coming from. I was not stoked on the drinking thing, which is my own stuff. I was able to set that aside. I was just doing what felt like my ethical responsibility here, which was to go and communicate up to my next level supervisor what was going on. My supervisor then turned to me and really, in a very unkind way, they turned to me and they were like, you always think that you know better than everybody else. You always think you're the smartest person and that you know what's best. And you never listen to anyone else. It caught me completely by surprise. It just felt really out of the blue. It felt really off the cuff. I'd made some big changes lately and I was really trying to seek their guidance on all of these things and really trying to learn and grow in some big ways. And so to have them say this to me, it really caught me by surprise. So in that relational field, in that relational dynamic, I was really activated. My supervisor was obviously not coming from a really great place either. And so I just kind of tucked that away and just let that percolate for a while. And then once I got to a place where I was more regulated, where I was calmer and I could see more clearly, I just took a step back and I just sat with it. I was like, this person actually knows me pretty well. We've worked together for 10 years. We've been through a lot together. Is that true? And that was where it got really uncomfortable for me, was because as I started to sit with it and work with it, I realized that actually at that point in time, that was true. I did really feel that way. And I still see some of those themes in my life, which is very uncomfortable for me. And then I worked with it to the point that I could, and then I set it down and I stepped away from it when I noticed that I was getting dysregulated. And then I've come back to that feedback really over a period of years, and I continue to check in with it. And I've realized that there is this part of me that wants to be the smartest person in the room, that wants to be a bit of a know-it-all. And the motivation behind that is wanting to be seen and loved and valued, and having lots of experiences where I didn't feel that way. And so the initial impact of this feedback from this person hurt really bad. So I set it aside. And then as I came back to it, I worked with it until I could see okay, actually there's some validity to that. And then I've just continued to work with that and monitor that over years. So hopefully that's a little helpful. Hopefully that provides a helpful example there. There are also times when I've had people throw things in my face that I'm like, I have no idea what you're talking about. That's really hurtful. You're coming from a place that's just really unkind. There is some obvious motivation here to cause hurt. And I'm just going to walk away from that. I'm not going to listen to what you have to say. So I've done that too. So that's kind of what I would say. So when we get the feedback, obviously we want to be in a place of connection. If we can't be in a place of connection, you can walk away from that. And it's also okay to not do anything at all and to just hold space for it until it becomes okay to work with it. Okay. Last question. Objective versus subjective truth. Does objective truth actually exist? Okay. So this is a great question. This is a great kind of philosophical approach, the nature of truth. This is a great question that a lot of people are wrestling with right now, and from a lot of different perspectives. When we look at the idea of truth is an interesting word. I think words are really important. It's something that is just part of how I see the world. And so I think we can look at this from a variety of perspectives. The word truth itself, we're saying things that are in accordance with fact or reality. That's one way of defining truth. Another way is a belief or fact that is accepted as true. And I think oftentimes when we talk about objective versus subjective truth, those are the frames we're looking at it through. And often we apply these questions to spiritual questions. We also apply them to all different kinds of questions and domains. One example that we could use that's really easy is gravity real? That's an objective thing that I can measure. I can go outside, I can throw something and it hits the ground. That's gravity. That's a real thing. I get the sense in this question, though, that's not really what we're talking about. And I think this word truth is one that really we get hung up on a lot. And so I love to look at the root, the etymology of the word, which comes from Old English, meaning faithfulness and constancy. And that really starts to change things a little bit. Now, am I saying there's no such thing as objective truth? That's not what I'm saying. We often are saying, are there things that are objectively factual in multiple domains of experience? For example, there is, in the realm of spiritual experience, there is the consistent debate on if there is objective truth in the existence of a divine being. And we're saying okay, objective truth, is it real? We also can look at it from other things. We could look at it from an astrological point of view. I saw a video, an Instagram reel where someone drew concentric rings and then looked at them from different perspectives, different visual perspectives, like a top-down, side view, and said truth is determined by your perspective. So we just have this thing, right? This thing with the word truth, and it's a prickly one. It's really sticky. I love this discussion that Neil deGrasse Tyson had around dimensions of existence, and that was a really helpful thing to consider as well. He said a two-dimensional being, if they are embedded in a piece of paper, they cannot experience the space that's above or below the piece of paper. To them, truth that they are able to experience exists solely within this piece of paper. Three-dimensional beings are able to step out of the piece of paper and they're able to experience the space above and below. When you step into the fourth dimension, now you experience time differently. Right. And at each dimensional level, and he was talking about how mathematics is able to prove the existence of different dimensions. That's way outside of my realm of expertise. I watched a video podcast that Neil deGrasse Tyson did. This is my research here. Take that with a grain of salt. He's just saying, like, when you're at a lower level, like a lower dimension, you're unable to perceive anything higher than that. And here's where I think we get hung up, is we say things like, it depends on your perspective. Because what we do is we approach this idea of truth or fact from a reductionist perspective. We say, my ability to see, experience, understand is limited to the reality that I occupy. And therefore, if it is outside of that, it is untrue. Or we take the other approach and we say, well, there's all these things that people talk about that are outside of my sphere of experience. That makes everything within my sphere of experience untrue. And I think neither of those is accurate. I think we've missed the mark. We're taking a very reductionistic approach. We're saying either or, as opposed to yes and. And we're also taking a word that has meant one thing and we're applying it to something else entirely. Now, I mean, obviously this is a philosophical question. This is a difficult question, and people are free to engage in some dialogue around it, and I welcome that. I love it. I would love to learn from people and hear their perspectives on it. I think it's important to say that, yes, objective truth actually exists. And just because there are things that exist outside of my realm of knowledge and experience, that does not intrinsically invalidate the truth that is known already. We can actually gain truth and then add to it. I love to use math as an example of this, in part because I'm so bad at math, but also because this really helps me to have some structure in my mind. So my ability to understand math has a ceiling to it. I did basic arithmetic. I did pre-algebra. I did algebra 1, algebra 2, geometry. I did about 2 to 3 weeks of trig. I did remedial college math, and then I did college algebra. And that was really where I tapped out. It was all the math I needed to do. There are other people that do trig, and they do pre-calc, and they do calculus, and they do differential equations, and they do all of this really advanced math. Now, that math is so advanced, it's well beyond my scope of understanding. I don't get it. That does not invalidate the math that I have learned up to this point. Like, there's still true principles in the math that I've learned. And as I learn more math, that then enhances rather than detracts from my understanding that I have. You can look at astronomy, like astrophysics. That's another great one. You can say, like, okay, once upon a time, in understanding the nature of the heavens, it was postulated that the Earth was at the center and everything rotated around the Earth. Now, there were some things in that theory that were incorrect. The Earth's not at the center. However, there is rotation that is happening, and some of that rotation does happen like around the Earth. There is a lot of rotation that's happening. There was then a theory that postulated that the sun was at the center of the solar system and that everything rotated around the sun. Everything orbited the sun, but in perfect circles. Now, there is some truth to that in our solar system, everything does orbit the sun. However, they don't orbit the sun in perfect circles. It's like they have these orbital patterns that have a special name that I can't remember, but they're definitely not perfect circles. And in order to understand the orbital path of the planets and their moons, they actually had to use the Earth-centric model in order to fix the sun-centric model with the perfect circles. And so you see the way that that this layering effect happens. Now, in all of these examples that we're using, these are objective things that we measure. And we measure them with all manner of different instruments and different tools. Now, that does not invalidate the subjective experience of truth as well, because we have one meaning of truth that is fact, or things that are like fact or reality, or things that are believed to be factual or associated with reality. But then we also have this faithfulness constancy thing. And when you look at the way research is conducted, you have quantitative research that is conducted. That's the stuff that is using instruments and tools and all manner of things to measure and explain things that are associated with fact and reality. We also have the subjective experience. That's qualitative data. That's the individual experience, which is just as valid. Both of those things can coexist quite beautifully. Sometimes it's really tense, but both can coexist. So this argument about objective truth existing or not is one that has been going on for a long time and will continue to persist. The way that I understand it is that yes, objective truth does exist. There are things that are real, that have been measured, that are described and understood by a variety of individuals who have repeated those experiments over time. And there are also subjective experiences with reality. I think the challenge we run into is where we say that because of my subjective experience, objective truth ceases to exist, as opposed to being able to hold the space for understanding and clarity to occur and to distill. I think that's where we really get into some trouble. So that's my thought on that. Obviously, I love to have a good conversation around this kind of stuff. I'm happy to do that. I'm happy to really engage and dig into it. And we can look at all the things and look at whatever people want to look at. And that's awesome. I would love that. The idea of us getting some food together, having a campfire, or it is about to be summer in Arizona, so maybe not a fire, but getting some food and sitting around and having some music and just having a great conversation about these kinds of things. Nothing would make me happier. So if that's something you want to do, let's do it. I would love it. It'd be amazing. Well, that's a wrap for this Q&A episode. These questions were deep, they were thoughtful, and a true reflection of the kind of conversations that we're working to build in this community around the Fertile Dark. Something today that we explored sparked a new insight or resonated with you, I would really love to hear your thoughts. So please reach out, share your reflections. And if you have more questions, keep them coming. These episodes are all about engaging with what's alive for you, so please don't hesitate to send in what's on your mind for the next time. And as always, thank you so much for being here, for asking hard questions, for being part of the Fertile Dark. So until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, trust the unfolding of your path, and as always, keep diving deep and embracing the journey.